Hi, I'm Joey Moloney. Joining us today on ESSA TV, thanks to the Economics Society of Australia, is Nobel laureate Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz, thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by asking you about your work on learning and innovation. Maybe you could tell us a bit about why it makes sense to focus on learning and what role you see for government in this respect.
The reason that it's so important is if we think about why it is that standards of living have increased enormously over the last 200 years after thousands of years of basically stagnation, it is because of learning, that we've learned how to do things better, to get more output out of any given level of input. And if that is the case, then it makes sense for economists to think about how do we learn better? How is it that we do learn, and how can we improve society's capabilities for learning?
I see.
Government inevitably plays a very important role. This is an area where markets don't work very well. We know markets are very good for allocating resources between steel and some other product, but in the areas of information, knowledge, markets don't work very well for some well-understood reason. Knowledge is like a public good. When one person conveys knowledge to another, it doesn't detract from the amount of knowledge that a person has. And that means that there are important externalities in having a society which is better at learning. So there is a understanding now that markets, as good as they may be in some areas, this is one area in which they don't work very well. All societies rely to a large extent on government for promoting education, basic research, and what I'm suggesting is they need to go beyond that to think about how to create a broader context in which societies can learn better.
I'd like to ask you about your work on inequality. Your book, The Price of Inequality, outlined exactly why inequality matters and what can be done to address it. And it seems that more and more people are starting to identify the dangers of growing inequality. Indeed, Christine Lagarde at the IMF identified it as a major concern. Does this make you more optimistic that policymakers will make genuine attempts at addressing growing inequality in the coming years?
Yes, it does. I think there has been a major change in our understanding of inequality. It used to be thought that there was a trade-off. The only way that we could get more equality was to give up on growth, economic efficiency. And now we understand that in the extremes of inequality, which the United States and many other countries have attained, we could have both more growth and more equality. It would actually help our economy. It's not going to be easy, though, even though there is widespread understanding of the benefits of having greater equality beyond the moral issues, beyond the broader aspects of how our society, our democracies function. At the same time, there are vested interests. There are people who have gained from the inequalities that have been increasing in our societies. So while it is true that there is broad understanding and among policymakers, even among people from, for instance, the financial community, the forces that are at play for increasing inequality are strong.
I'd also like to ask you about the movement for pluralism in economics, particularly in teaching. Do you think that there's anything wrong with the way undergraduates are taught economics? And if so, what do you think an ideal undergraduate education would look like?
Well, I think it was clear that before the crisis there was an excessive dominance of a single particular perspective, a perspective that said that markets were efficient, were stable, that you could rely on markets. The crisis showed that that was not true. And there were a whole set of other doctrines that were taught in the elementary economics course as if they were fact. Ideas like central banks ought to focus on inflation, the more independent the central bank, the better. These were doctrines that were not supported by good economics, but they became very conventional wisdom. There were other ideas that were incorporated in some textbooks, but not others. Mentioned almost always, but the question is whether they a footnote or were they given attention. Important ideas like behavioral economics, information asymmetries, game theory, importance of inequality. All of these were always mentioned. The question is what prominence was given to them. Were they first order or second order? Were they just qualifications on the general theory that markets work well? Or were they first order things that you had to think about? I think it is important that we pay more attention to these things that were neglected. First order effects on inefficiencies in the economy, externalities including climate change, problems of inequality, problems of knowledge, learning, innovation economy, all these things which we're giving short shrift in traditional economics courses. These are topics that ought to be given now more attention.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for your time today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your time in Australia.
I'm looking forward to it.